Today, we're talking about antagonists, the sisters of your protagonist's parents. No, wait, that's antagonists. That's something else. An antagonist is something that often ruins picnics. I'm sorry, I'll stop. The antagonist, as the name apparently implies, is the character opposing your protagonist. Anti-protagonist was apparently too hard to say. The antagonist brings with them some common misconceptions that don't necessarily detract from the antagonist, but often limit the scope of the character and muddle the meaning of the word. So I'd like to dispel some of those misconceptions here today. I mean, they're called the antagonists, not the cantagonist, so we really need to clear this stuff up. I'm sorry, I said I'd stop that. All right, antagonist misconception number 1, the antagonist is the same thing as the villain. While the Venn diagram of antagonists and villains does have a large overlapping area, the terms do not describe the same character. Antagonists are defined solely by their opposition to the protagonist. They either want what the protagonist wants, or they desperately want the protagonist to not get whatever it is that the protagonist wants. Antagonists are defined by opposition. Villains are characters pursuing evil things for evil reasons. They only become an antagonist when they oppose a heroic protagonist. You can have antagonists who are not villains. They might be a morally upstanding romantic rival. They might be a sports team from another town. They might be somebody competing for the same acting role as your protagonist. They don't have to be a villain. There doesn't need to be anything evil or villainous about an antagonist. They only need to oppose the protagonist. Incidentally, the opposite is also true. Your protagonist does not need to be a hero. There is a such thing as a villain protagonist and the ever popular anti-hero who is arguably not a hero but often a protagonist. These are a bit rarer than your pure hero protagonists, but it still can be done. One thing that you do need to make sure, though, is that your antagonist is less likable than your protagonist. The audience should be rooting for the protagonist and really desire for them to get what they want, and they should be rooting against your antagonist. So it might be better said that the defining characteristics of an antagonist are opposition to the protagonist and also lower likability relative to the protagonist. Next up, misconception about the antagonist number 2. Your antagonist doesn't need to be developed, or said another way, your antagonist needs less attention than your protagonist. I don't know if this is a misconception so much as just something that people realize they need to do. I would say that for the most part, a story will suffer more from a poorly defined antagonist than it will from a poorly defined protagonist. As long as they face a really interesting antagonist, you can pluck any peasant off of a farm and give them a magic bracelet, and the story will probably still be interesting. Provided the antagonist is really well developed, really unlikable, and really interesting, the reader will likely latch onto the story even if the protagonist is kind of mediocre. You want to put as much effort into developing your antagonist as you do in developing your protagonist, if not more. I've talked before about the human negativity bias, about how we are naturally wired to find and focus on problems, and the antagonist is the source of all of your story's problems. Generic evil villains or flawless romantic partners or squads of super skilled sports ball players are not going to engage the reader. We need details. We need to really hate the antagonist, and that takes effort and character development. Your story can probably survive a subpar protagonist as long as you have a really good antagonist. I mean, a giant white whale with 50 harpoons in its belly that's sunk in half a dozen ships is way more interesting than some grizzled old sea captain who's missing a leg. That's probably why Melville named the book after the whale and not Ahab. A good antagonist can carry a lot of weight in your story and could become a defining feature of your story, so make sure that you're giving them their proper due. And lastly, misconception number 3, the antagonist needs to be a character at all. There are a lot of stories where the antagonist is not a personified character, but rather just some kind of opposing force. If your story involves climbing a mountain or dealing with a big-ass hurricane or surviving on a deserted island, then the antagonist is not going to be a character at all. These stories are generally framed as character versus nature conflicts, where the protagonist is not opposing another character, but rather some kind of force of nature. You can also have character versus technology type stories where the character is dealing with some kind of technological problem, like a spaceship with vapor lock or a server that won't boot. Although with character versus technology stories, there's always the potential that the technology can basically become a character, but that works too. There is also the possibility that the antagonist is the same character as the protagonist. That's right, we've traced the opposition, and it's coming from inside the protagonist. These are the classic character versus self conflicts where the protagonist needs to overcome some kind of internal flaw in order to resolve the main plot of the story. In this case, the antagonist is essentially whatever flaw the protagonist is trying to overcome, so it's not personified as an external force, nor is it a separate character. So your antagonist can really be anything you want it to be. You shouldn't limit yourself. It can be anyone you want it to be, including someone who isn't a someone at all. Just like you were someone who watched this entire video. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.